Hello, so my name is Gerry White and welcome to my sort of talk on page speed. I'm going to quickly just load up some slides and hopefully you can see them. Give me a shout if you can't hear me particularly well or you can hear some noises in the background. Now, oddly enough, I was supposed to be doing this in a completely different room, much better background, much better lighting, but somebody decided to start chopping down some trees outside. And I'm also expecting an Amazon parcel at some point. So if that happens, that will be embarrassing. So this is a quick talk on page speed in 2021. This is something that I've been kind of obsessed with for about 5 years from previous roles, and it's something which I quite enjoy trying to resolve because a lot of the time, every single website, different challenges. So let's kind of talk through this fairly steadily. As I say, give me a shout if it gets very noisy or I need to fix something. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slides. And basically this talk is actually not just about page speed, but it's about hacks and tricks to make your site feel faster and actually make it feel more user-friendly, because Google, me, everybody, we're all basically saying that, it's not about page speed so much as it's actually about how people feel when they're using your site. It's about the user experience far more than anything else. And Google have even been saying that as well. Quick bit about me. This is a photograph from before lockdown when I was slimmer and I hadn't basically eaten my way through lockdown. I've been working with hundreds of clients over the last 25 years, everybody from banking through to charities, through to the government, through to BBC, you name it. I've probably worked with them at some point or a competitor. If anybody has any questions on that, give me a shout. Currently, my role is the SEO director at Rise at 7, who are a creative SEO agency, and we're doing quite a lot of page speed work for quite a lot of our clients. Page speed shouldn't be as much of an issue as it is. It's almost confusing as to why we're obsessed with it. And the reason I say that is actually 5G is coming out. Everybody's got 4G mobile phones. Broadband speeds, I mean, we're talking about 100 megabit download speeds for a lot of people. My home broadband now is 50 to 60. I can watch HD Netflix on 4 televisions at once without anything getting impacted. So why are websites so slow and clunky? And why is Google and users and everybody obsessed with them? Why is it such an impact? As I say, we can see that 5G is coming out at the moment. London, it's coming everywhere, all over the place. It's everywhere basically. But again, nobody has got 5G mobile phones. They've probably got the connections available to them, but it's only patchy and it's not everywhere. And even when you've got 4G, there's a really good chance you'll be going in just slightly the wrong area and you'll be dropping down to much slower speeds. The biggest problem is the fact that what we've done is we've actually slowed down websites. The more that we can push down, the more we do. And this seems to be all of those hidden things like marketing tags, particularly Facebook tags. Facebook tags seem to really slow down websites. User experience features. I say this, but it's often where you sort of move your mouse around and suddenly it says, oh, you're leaving the site. Let us give you something. We've got a script to kind of tell you whether or not this product is being popular. We've got another script to test something else. And then, of course, we've got optimizely tests, which mean that people are actively swapping out the content to see whether or not there's different tests going on. We often do this ourselves. I love A/B testing, and it's something that I think is really, really important. But do it right, make sure it doesn't slow down your webs too much. Everybody loves a different custom font, and the amount of times we found that the stack of custom fonts going into a web page or a website can be megabytes of size, and the amount of unused JavaScript on every single web page is getting painful. And as I say, it's like a death from a thousand cuts. When you first create a website, it loads blindingly fast. Everything is absolutely perfect. Everything is great. But then 6 months later, it's just slowing down. And why? Because we've added something. We've added an extra feature. We've added something that needs a little bit more JavaScript. We've changed the payment gateway, but we've left the JavaScript for that particular system in there. We've changed the login system, but instead of removing some or changing some, we've added more. We've added more images. Everything basically adds up. And we know that Google has already done some research into this. If your website is slower, your bounce rate increases, your conversion rate decreases. There is a lot of times when this becomes more of an issue. And it's not so much about the page load time, it's more about the page load experience. So if you can improve the experience, that is where it counts. And I think that one of the things that's quite important is this whole perception of time. And the reason I say this is reason that Google have kind of come up with this Core Web Vitals. They've come up with 3 sets of numbers which are more about user experience than they are about actual page speed. I love this kind of story that I found basically about Houston Airport. Houston Airport discovered that when people get off the plane and they have to wait for their baggage, if they have to wait a long time for their baggage, they get frustrated, they complain, and they got so many complaints they had to investigate it. What they found was if they reroute the people to the furthest away baggage carousel, they still have to wait just as long, but because they've walked further and because they've actually experienced a little bit more of an issue, then the complaints for actually how long they've actually had to wait at the carousel have completely dropped down. So it's kind of an interesting thing where it's not the perception, it's not the actual waiting time, it's the perception of waiting time that they fixed. And as I say, Google have been saying since 2018 that they've rolled out page speed as a ranking factor in mobile users. So this is as early as 2018, which is now 3+ years ago. And so we are now basically already in a world where page speed has an impact. But what they have said is that it will only affect the really slow users. So most of the websites that we work on, most of the websites you probably work on, are probably fast enough that it doesn't really impact it. However, what has now happened is in May 2019, they've basically said that, in May 2020, they basically said that page experience signals will be included in the search rankings. They actually said they were going to roll this out in May 2021, but they've actually delayed it back a little bit. What they've basically said is that there's going to be a set of metrics that they'll use to say whether or not the website is a good user experience or not. These 3 metrics are largest contentful paint, first input delay, and cumulative layout shift. These metrics basically are how fast the page kind of loads, how fast it's kind of like there for a user experience, how quickly you can start to interact with it, which is the first input delay, and the visual stability, which is the cumulative layout shift. The CLS one, the cumulative layout shift, that's a little bit of a more confusing one to explain, and that's basically where things jump around the page. The best example is when you're trying to click one thing, and as something loads up above it, it goes down, so you accidentally click the wrong thing. It's happened to all of us so many times, and it used to be very, very annoying. As I say, they've basically delayed it. So now they've basically said that the rollout will be a gradual rollout in June this year. And what will be included is exactly what we said before, but it will be a slower rollout. And it's basically, they've said that the reason for this is the fact that people aren't quite getting there with all of the kind of the impact yet. One of the things that I did quite recently was we improved page speed by 30% simply by not firing all the marketing tags until the web page had finished loading. This was such a simple, quick win. It was one of those, we are loading up 10 marketing tags, including Facebook, PPC, all sorts of free-to marketing, affiliate tracking, all of this other stuff. And by basically saying, right, load the web page first and then load all the marketing tags, page speed was improved by 30%. What is interesting is we've taken this same thing and repeated it multiple times. And this is an easy thing normally in Google Tag Manager, because in Google Tag Manager, you can say, when do we fire it? So you can change the firing it across all pages to firing it later across all pages. And as long as you don't move back things like your analytics tags, you probably not see a drop in any conversion data. And the reason I say this is because when we did it, what we learned was that most of the time, the people that were engaged we're also going to wait for the page to be loaded. So there's no point retargeting people who weren't engaged with your website, that weren't basically going to wait till the web page loaded up. So we actually reduced the cost of retargeting. We reduced the costs of some of the additional kind of costs associated with it, because actually we did find we dropped about 10% of people firing the tags, but those people weren't going to buy. This is a slide I've stolen from a guy called Jono, and basically this explains how the web page loads up. It's saying, and this is basically where we can really improve things. Chrome is a fantastic way of analyzing how a web page loads. They've got all these hidden tools that are incredibly powerful. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it all, but I'm going to kind of simplify this. And basically this is the DNS lookup. How long does it take to find your website? How long does it take to kind of start requesting things? How long does the server take to respond and start to push everything down? And then how long does it take for everything to kind of get loaded up? Now, all of this stuff is fairly simple to kind of optimize in theory, but in practice, particularly on JavaScript heavy websites, websites with external sources such as Google Maps or videos or large kind of carousels. It's understanding what you really need to load first and what you need to load later. And as I say, JavaScript is where we really struggle to kind of get things really improved. And the reason why is we know that a lot of the CSS, a lot of the JavaScript isn't used on that initial load for all pages. But you kind of want to make sure that all of this stuff is loaded up into the cache. So as when they visit the next page, you're not loading tiny bits here, tiny bits there. So it's kind of a balancing act between the user experience on one page and across the site. So how slow is your site? Now, we've created these dashboards using the Google Chrome, what we call Crux. It's the Google Chrome user experience data. And basically, this is data that Google themselves have published into BigQuery data stores, and you can access it. Anybody can access it, particularly on a big website. Now, I'm picking on Boots because Boots have got a terrible, terrible page speed and an awful user experience. As I was trying to buy actually, I'm lying, it wasn't me. As a friend of mine was trying to buy a load of products, I was watching her trying to buy about £150 worth of beauty products and cleaning products and everything else like that. And she got to the point where the user experience was so poor that she actually quit from it and decided at that point she had had enough. She was going to go to a different website. That means that you are losing traffic if your CLS, your largest contentful paint, all of it is that poor. So having witnessed somebody losing it, I kind of understand just exactly how important this really is. And when I worked at Just Eat, what we did discover is that the page speed didn't have as much of an impact on the user conversion rate on that visit. What we learned was that users would come back time and time again if it was a good user experience. If it was a bad user experience, there were competitors. People from Just Eat wouldn't necessarily shop at Just Eat. They'd go and they'd use Deliveroo or Uber Eats or whoever else it was. So page speed doesn't just have an impact on the conversion rate of that one transaction, it has a user-based conversion rate. As I say, we kind of knew by testing that we could see that slowing down or improving the user experience for users had an impact across multiple visits. And that was what was really, really critical for us. Argos is a good example here. You can see that they are much, much better. In fact, actually, do you know what? I can compare them side by side. So if you look here, this is Argos and Boots side by side. You can see just how much better a user experience Argos is. And Argos are actively working on it. You can see the trends going upwards. You can see that things are improving for them a lot of the time. And all websites at the moment that we're working on are actively trying to improve the user experience because we know this May or June, it is, rollout could negatively impact a lot of websites. Like I say, these dashboards are built in Google Data Studio using the Crux data, and actually you can build your own using that particular link. It's a very simple link to kind of remember, honestly, or you can just Google it, Chrome User UX Dashboard in Data Studio. You can create your own for your own website, and you can also compare competitors if they've got enough traffic. You need a certain amount of traffic for it to be important, and it's a great thing. The downside to this is it is a little bit out of date, as in for this month, it'll kind of be arriving around the 14th for last month. So it's about 30 days out of date almost. So the problem here, of course, is the fact that as you make improvements, you want to see it literally as it's coming in. The other place that we always look for is Google Search Console. Now, this is a client that we've just taken on, and we're just improving a lot of things for them. And we're looking forward to seeing good taking over from the poor. This will tell you which page is where in the site it is underperforming. And it's definitely something to kind of investigate. I recommend everybody gets access to Google Search Console so as they can really dive down into it. GT Metrics is an amazing way in which you can analyze a particular web page or website. So you can take a web page, you put it into GT Metrics, and it will pull out huge amounts of data for you. So if you've got a website that you think is underperforming, GT Metrics is literally the first place I'd go to. And because it's kind of a hosted solution, it's not affected by your own website. There are lots of different tools, and Web Page Test is one of them as well. But this is still GT Metrics. You could look through all of the different metrics, including the core web vitals, and it will tell you exactly where, what, how things can be improved as well. It'll also give you quite a nice visualization that you can share with developers. You can talk to people about it and say, look, actually, we're trying to load up over a megabyte of JavaScript. Do we actually need a megabyte of JavaScript? that seems far, far too much. So we can basically say, actually, the fonts isn't the problem. It's not the HTML, it's not the images, it's the JavaScript. In the case of Boots, for instance, the images were massively oversized, and I would have gone through and compressed every single image, as well as making sure that the fonts and the JavaScript were optimized as much as possible. So how do I go about optimizing a website? The first thing I would do is basically target those low-hanging fruits. And the way in which I do that, by the way, I love business speak. Business lingo is my favorite thing. In fact, I mean, the conference that we run is called Take It Offline because of the fact that I was constantly told take it offline as being a kind of expression in meetings. So the first thing I do is use Lighthouse on all major templates. If you don't know what Lighthouse is, it's built into Chrome and it's accessed very simply by just right-clicking on a page, clicking on audits, and then you can basically run it. Now, I would only run it for performance and best practices. The accessibility, the SEO are a little bit rubbish. It's almost like it's a tick box exercise that just isn't worth it. So ignore those bits. I'd also slow it down to basically a simulated 4G and a 4x CPU slowdown. And the reason for this is what it does is it basically emulates an older person's phone. I know that sounds like I'm being a bit ageist, but I have found that young people today seem to have the latest devices. They have the newest iPhones, they have the newest Samsungs, but older people often have lower quality devices. And one of the things that we did recently for a client is we took a look at the page speed impact of what users were using across their user base. So, and we found that there were low-end, cheaper Samsung devices that were underperforming across the website. We created this using a Data Studio report, and it was very, very simple to kind of do. It was basically looking at the page speed impact for everybody and what device they were using. This was basically to kind of convince the developers that they couldn't just throw all the JavaScript, all of the optimization on it, and it would render as quickly as it would. This is the output from Lighthouse, and it is a very simple thing. It basically gives you the metrics of the first contentful paint, the time to interactive, the speed index, the total blocking time, largest contentful paint, all of the core web vitals, and a few extra bits of data. And it also gives you kind of hints as to what it is that's going wrong. Now, if you're trying to run this on your own computer, you might get different results to somebody else running it on their computer as well. So what I do recommend is if you're sharing the results, use webdev measure, which is web.dev/measure. And that way you get much more consistent results because you're doing it using a cloud-based computer that can be shared. And the reason that you'll get different results to someone else and everybody gets different scores is because it will kind of depend on your network, your connections, where you are, and lots of other different kind of factors. So I do use it personally on my own laptop a lot, but when I'm talking about sharing the results, I often use a consistent source just because otherwise it's kind of a discussion point. These are the hints that it comes out with. It comes out with things like the render blocking assets, such as remove unused JavaScript. Again, if you're loading 2 megabytes of JavaScript to kind of render the page, and only 100 kilobytes of it's used to actually generate the page, then you're obviously asking it to download a huge amount more than it's actually required. And a lot of the time, the JavaScript that's being loaded, things like Algolia search. Algolia, by the way, is a great on-site search, but you don't necessarily need to load it just to render the page. So you can say defer it. Deferring it means that load the page first, then afterwards load up the JavaScript. Deferring things really does help. And we've gone through and actively deferred as much JavaScript and as much kind of content as we can to make sure that the initial page renders perfectly. Sorry, just take a break. The other thing we strongly recommend is using HTTP2. Now, I was nearly deleted this slide because I thought to myself, everybody is on HTTP2. Who isn't using HTTP2, especially now that HTTP3 is coming out? With HTTP3 coming out, there is no reason for us to be using HTTP2. So I was surprised then when I started looking around to discover just how many different websites were not using HTTP2. Again, picking on Boots because Boots, well, yeah, it's Boots. And their images were being loaded on HTTP1. So this means that what happens is, well, I'll kind of go into more details a bit later on, but basically it means that it's loading one image, then one image, then one image, then one image, rather than pushing them all down at once. It's like saying that I want everything to go through a kind of freeway motorway instead of a superhighway. Again, it tells you about removing unused CSS and enabling text compression. There's so many little hints and tips that can be done. And again, if using a CDN, CDNs, like they're a content delivery network like Cloudflare, a lot of this stuff is automatic. So we do strongly recommend using a CDN of some sort, or at least configuring your server to kind of do all this stuff for you. Things like minifying JavaScript. This isn't something that you normally need to do yourself. Normally, if you're using a CMS such as WordPress or basically any CMS, it can normally be done for you automatically. If it isn't, then you can do it yourself by just uploading this file to a compression website, and it will do it all for you. The other thing is using font display CSS. Now, what you can do is you can say, do not display the web page, even if we haven't displayed the fonts already. So you're not waiting for megabytes of fonts to download. I'll go into that in a bit more detail as well in a minute. The other thing, of course, is reducing the amount of times waiting for JavaScript to load up. Again, this is the biggest problem that we've been experiencing recently. We've been finding that the web pages we're working on now have got so much JavaScript used in rendering the page, but it's so complicated that on a slow mobile phone device, it is taking a long time for anything to be loaded up. And this is actually the big issue. And the thing is, developers usually work on desktop computers with fast processors. They then test on their own high-speed devices. Nobody tests on a terrible old-school device that it costs £100 from Argos. And when you go into your analytics, you can see which devices are slowing down the website. So you can see which is kind of causing the issues. So have a look in your analytics at the devices that are being used. Have a look at the ones that are underperforming. And that is where we kind of focus on to kind of improve things. The other thing that we kind of look at is this critical requests. What is absolutely critical for the website to load before it kind of can be displayed? And again, this is CSS and fonts and JavaScript. Anything that we can defer, we do it. Again, this is some more hints from Lighthouse. I won't go into too much details, but what you can do is you can say, limit the amount for developers. So for instance, if you turn around to your developers or your CMS and say, I only want 500 kilobytes of image total, or 300 kilobytes of images in total, working to some targets can really help you improve. One of the things that we did do at Just Eat was we used the script created by a guy called Simo Ava to audit all of the pages, or at least a sample of all the pages, and write these to a BigQuery. This meant that we could create a dashboard that we were tracking on a weekly basis. This meant that what we were able to do was really investigate which pages were consistently slow, and if pages were slowing down. We took a sample of 20 of the category pages. We took a sample of 20 of the product pages, the home page, and we also threw in a couple of pages from competitors. And the reason we would do this is it was often easier for us to turn around and say, we're slower than competitors, we need budget to improve it, than it was for us to actually say we need budget to improve it because it's not fast enough. Giving people a reason to improve it, often beating the competitors, is a good reason. And actually, that's exactly how Google are kind of rolling out their updates, by basically saying, if you're the slowest, you might be deranked. This is what it kind of looked like. I've had to blur it a little bit because there's kind of a little bit sensitive information there, but we kind of created it. After we store the information in Google BigQuery, we could then basically load it up into a Google Data Studio dashboard. One of the things that we have been doing with clients recently at Rise at 7 is we've been starting to store their page speed information into Google Analytics. Now, my JavaScript is not that great, but this basically is relatively simple, and I've found loads of kind of quick ways in which I can cut and paste code into a website, and basically using Google Tag Manager, pull this information out again into our own reporting. So if you guys have used Google Analytics, I'm sure pretty much everybody uses Google Analytics now, even if it's GA4 or the current or the older version. You probably know there is some page speed information in there, but it's not very good. So what we do is we enhance it, and it looks like this. We can now suddenly see the CLS values, the largest contentful paint, the first input delay, And because we've got these values tracked, we can then start to map them month by month, day by day. We can build this into reporting, which really does help us to kind of export and analyze the data. And we can do this at a page level. So I can basically say, right, using that secondary dimension, add in the page level for which CLS pages are particularly bad. And this is kind of really helping us to really diagnose which pages across a bigger website are particularly bad. And the reason this is really, really important is it's not the pages you expect sometimes. It's often part of the payment gateway that actually becomes the real issue. So we really want to dig in down to where it is. There are also hundreds of other tools like SEMrush, for instance, that will allow you to kind of track your page speeds. I've had to kind of highlight which client this isn't, but this is a website we will start working on soon. And you can see already that their largest contentful paint is terrible, according to the Core Web Vitals report in SEMrush. So we know where we need to improve it. We can see that CLS is good. So any dashboards that we've got, we set them up. We use this across hundreds of different ones. This includes Systrix, SEMrush. We even use Screaming Frog to kind of go across an entire site and pull everything out. So we have a number of tools. And as long as we can pull the data out, store it somewhere, we can kind of track improvements and issues. Oops. Oh, yeah, and as I say, one of the things that we do is when we're doing the lighthouse of the template pages, there are pages that a lot of the time gets missed, particularly by SEO people. And this is the payment funnel and the site search. How slow is your site search if you do a site a query thing? Again, this is something from Jono. 20% of users abandon the shopping cart if the transaction process is too slow. And again, I've watched this myself, watching a friend of mine trying to buy from the Boots website. She found it so slow, she actually quit. And one of the things that I hadn't thought about before until relatively recently was the fact that we normally test our websites not at the peak time. We normally test it when there are less users on the site. If we test it at the peak time, then we can see just how slow some of the bottlenecks really are, particularly if you've got APIs or product listings or anything which has got a level of server sides kind of pushing. So database queries, anything that's kind of like that, that's when you need to test it. So if I test it at, I don't know, 10 a.m. on a Monday, it might be blindingly fast, but 6 p.m. on a Friday, it might be very, very slow. So that is what we really need to check. As I mentioned, one of the things that you can do is you could use Screaming Frog to find all of the page speed information you possibly can. And one of the quick wins here, for instance, is you crawl the website and you find where the biggest images are. The biggest images is that low-hanging fruit. So you can take those large images and just compress them. And it is very simple to compress them, which I'll come on to in a minute. One of the kind of cool things that they brought out in version 12, I think we're now on version 16, is the fact that you can now pull out metrics using the Google PageSpeed API. So this brings out all of the Web Vitals and hundreds of other kind of scores and details. So now it's not just which is the biggest page, which is the slowest time to first byte, but huge amounts of other kind of key data. And we pull out all of this data and push it into Google Data Studio reports using Google Sheets. And this means that we've got the ability to really overly analyze a website web page. And although one thing that I haven't got in this image is I would normally recommend doing on a mobile device and using the JavaScript render. Screaming Frog is $99 a year, or £99 a year, sorry, and it's so powerful. If anybody hasn't got it, I'd strongly recommend it. Chrome is the best diagnostic tool around as well. This is like, and it's like that it's not just an X-ray machine, it's the MRI machine, it's the surgical tool of choice. Or Firefox is similar. I'm not just going to promote Chrome, but basically any of these tools, they've got these tools which allow you to really understand what is slowing down the web page. I think this is absolutely critical. This is something which my team and I have been using and focusing on a huge amount. And every time we think we've got to the bottom of it, we discover that there's another hidden thing within Chrome, because actually they've got all the tools, but it's very hard to find everything and understand everything. This is kind of a view of how a web page loads, and you can see what the protocol is, the schema, the size, the time, and it's really exciting for us to be able to kind of look at exactly how the web page is being loaded up. What's kind of interesting here is, again, as you can see the size of that, the assets, this is for the image, for the actual HTML, for everything. So you can see size very, very quickly. One of the things you can do, I think somehow I've missed it out of this because I PDF'd a PowerPoint. But if you right click on any of the column headings, you can add in or take away columns. And there's a number of columns which you can add in, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a minute. If you're compressing an image, the one thing that I recommend is Squoosh.app. Again, this is another Google thing, and it's very, very simple to use. And you can cut and paste images into it now, which is amazing. So you take an image that you want to compress. If you're adding an image to a blog, you compress it in there, paste it in there, and it works. You can just upload your images as well. And here's the image I downloaded from the Boots homepage. And if you see there, you can compress it by 70% without any image quality loss at all. You can use the slider to kind of slide it back and forth to kind of see just how much of an impact it's had. And I generally compress things to there is almost a noticeable visual difference, but you can compress things a huge amount by using the right compression, the right quality settings, and also resizing it. This image was supposed to be used on the mobile phone, and it's a massive image. I would normally have resized it. In fact, I could get it down to about 95% drop of image size by resizing it as well as using the right compression. One thing that I didn't realize a while back was the fact that I was compressing images for mobile phones without realizing that on a Retina screen, the image looks far worse than it does on a old Apple iPhone. So Retina screens have made our job a little bit more fun. And what you can do is use image source sets to say, actually, what I want to do is have a high-res version, a low-res version, and a super res version on this. And Chrome and other browsers will select the best image for that device. So you get responsive images, and you can also say whether or not it's high res or not. And it's quite a powerful way of bringing in the best images for the device as it's loading up. The other thing you can do is lazy loading, and this I think is really important. It's a very simple thing where you just kind of add a tag into the image saying loading equals lazy. What this means is the fact that it won't load up until everything else is loaded up. So it will kind of just sort of say that it won't load up even until you kind of scroll down and start to look at it. So this really does help a lot. We're adding this to things like YouTube videos, for instance, where we add it to iframe sources, loading equals lazy, because the amount of times that people will not scroll down to the bottom of a page before they've clicked onto the next page. And you want that time to interactive, that time to the first contentful pane, all of those metrics to be really good, because that is a better user experience. You don't want it to slow down to the rest of the page. So clearly, what you want is for everything to kind of be as fast as possible for the user as they load up the page, and then they load up everything that's down the bottom of the page. One thing that is also very critical is server configuration. I mentioned before about HTTP2. There's loads of other things. And oh yes, here, this is how you can add in the additional columns or take them away. One of the things that I like is something called protocol. Protocol shows you whether or not it's on HTTP2 or HTTP1. Now, this isn't actually enabled by default, but this means that you can see if they're going to be on HTTP2, HTTP3, however they're going to be loaded up. And I always make sure that I've got this enabled very quickly when I'm doing website analysis. This shows you here clearly that there's a lot of images loaded at HTTP1 on the Boots website. So this is pretty terrible. This is such a win for them. I would help load up that web page so much faster for them. And the reason why is that HTTP1 kind of loads up like 10 things at once, and then it loads up the next 10, then it loads up the next 10, then loads up the next 10. And if you've got a lot of images coming from one server, then you basically push them down all at once, and it is much better, much faster. Servers can handle it. It's not a problem. It's a far better approach. There's a kind of a nice demo here, basically by Akamai, where they show that the difference in load time for this is on the first one, it's 20 seconds. On the second one, it's 3 seconds. I'd recommend having a look at that sometime. It's a great way to kind of demonstrate to other people what happens. One of the things that they have done is they've also said about like HTTP2 pushes. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this too much. I've tried doing some pushes and it hasn't helped as much as I thought it was going to. And I think they're deprecating this at the moment. So I would strongly recommend not necessarily investing too much time in this. So this is something which I think is an opportunity. It's just not actually working particularly well for us. As I mentioned before, CDNs are fairly critical. CDNs basically allow you to kind of cache versions of your web page around the world. So for instance, if your server is based in Montreal, but your customers are based in Berlin, they will get a Berlin cached copy of your content. Or it's not always Berlin, but it could be London, it could be wherever, but it will be much, much, much faster, particularly if you've got an international client base. Even so, what will happen as well is if you've got your servers based in London for your clients based in London, but Google's based in California, that means that Google will see the Californian-based site, so they'll be able to crawl and index your website much, much faster. The other thing I'd make sure is all of your assets, all of your files are stored on the CDN and efficiently as possible. There's lots of things you can do to kind of improve that. And if you use Cloudflare, one of the things that we've been doing for our customers is going in and testing what will happen if we flick all the switches, because there's all sorts of different compression techniques, all sorts of different things built in, and this really does add value to the way in which it works. And the best thing about this is the fact it's free. By using the free plan, you'll be able to kind of get a lot of the weight compression, a lot of the page speed enhancements without worrying too much about the expense. This does mean that this is something that I definitely recommend for all websites, the free plan, until you get to a certain level. There are websites you can't put on it. For instance, if you use a Wix website, you can't put it on Cloudflare easily. If you use a lot of Shopify, for instance, you might not be able to put it on Cloudflare. But almost all server-hosted websites you can probably put on Cloudflare or something similar. We've got clients who use Azure, we've got clients that use all sorts of different CDNs, but we kind of know Cloudflare is one of the leading ones at the moment on innovation in this space. The other thing that's quite interesting is that even if you're not using CDNs and using things like jQuery or similar libraries, Dojo, or trying to give other kind of good examples, a lot of the time people are trying to host them on their own website. Now, if you load them up from the Google free CDN and everyone else is doing it, obviously it means that they'd probably be cached. There are kind of minor issues with doing this. For instance, we have on a lot of our websites something called a CSP, which means that you have to kind of whitelist external resources. So make sure that if you do this, you whitelist the external resources. This is kind of a quick demonstration by Cloudflare for one of our clients, and they basically believe that from their tests that this website, one of the client websites, is 23% faster on Cloudflare. And we run this quite regularly just to kind of double check things. And we also kind of go through the details to kind of make sure that everything's perfect. The other thing that it has got as well, and a lot of CDNs have got something similar, is a built-in image compression. This means that we don't have to worry as much about compressing all the images because Cloudflare can do it for you. This is called Polish or Polish. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it. At some point I'll find out. But basically Polish optimizes the resource. It will tell you the best image type, the best compression level for the users that are coming onto your websites. And different users might get different levels of compression based on their page speed, the browser they're using, all sorts of bits and pieces, because some of the image compression you can use, like WebP, isn't as compatible with all browsers. Another thing that I quite like, and this is in the free one, is the auto minification. So it will automatically remove all of the comments and the white space and everything else like that in your JavaScript, and it will kind of compress it right down as much as possible. And it will do this with the CSS and HTML. This can significantly drop the file sizes of a lot of the different sites. Ooh, I've just noticed sort of running with 5 minutes left, so I'll kind of go through quite quickly. And here we've got cache control as well. If everything's cached well, every time somebody revisits a page, it means that it won't have to reload it. So we make sure our cache control is perfectly set up. This is very, very simple. Is it cached? Yes. Don't reload it. And we kind of make sure the headers and everything is as well done as possible. Now, this is how long you've kind of set it for. So for instance, 1 minute equals 60. If it's 1 year, it's 315,306,000. So it's something which is fairly simple. A lot of the time we set it to a week. The reason why is that most visitors are kind of coming back around a time. We want to make sure it's a week. One of the issues that we found is that if we do this, then if we make changes to the CSS or the JavaScript, people are using cached versions of it. So we have that big problem that we can't actually test the new one. I'm going to speed up slightly. So what we do is we put a parameter on it to say, this is the new version of it in the particular page so we can retest it. Okay, with fonts. Use web-safe fonts where possible. Make sure that you're sort of limiting all of the fonts as much as you possibly can to, because what will happen is they'll try to load up all the fonts before loading up the page, and that could be painful. This is basically how it loads up. So basically the CSS will then, what happens, you'll fetch the HTML, then you'll fetch the CSS. The CSS will then fetch the font. So by the time this kind of cascade, this rolling thing happens, it can slow things right down. So making sure that your fonts are loaded up as soon as possible is quite important. One of the things you can do is you can say, don't worry about loading the font. You will kind of load it afterwards, and that means that you'll kind of swap it out, or you even say optional. Now, we tried using the swap feature for a lot of our fonts at Just Eat. But what actually happened was the fact that, whoops, this is something different. What actually happened when we did it was the fact that it swapped, the text kind of jumped around and it looked terrible. It looked as though it was buggy rather than particularly cool. So that was kind of an issue. One of the other things you can do is you can actually just load in the styles that you want. So the boldness and a subset. And this is definitely something we'd recommend. You can even just choose the characters you want. So for instance, if it's only like 4 characters, you could do it like that. I wouldn't bother with that. I think that's more hard work than it's worth. And as I say, you can do the swap thing. And as I say, it just looked terrible. Don't do the swap thing unless you're really testing. Testing things fine, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Okay, I'm running out of time. So code coverage is built into Chrome. It's kind of hidden away. And make sure that, make sure that you're not looking at your extensions. So run it in incognito mode. And again, with the code coverage, it is hidden away. It's in the More Tools coverage, and then you basically have to reload the page. It isn't as simple as it sounds, so make sure you do it, and then make sure you browse around the website, and it will tell you how much of the coverage is being used. The other thing you can do is look at the priority. You can't actually optimize the priority. You can't actually change the priority, but this tells you how the browser is interpreting the priority of everything loaded into the browser bar. So having a look at that gives you an idea of what is slowing down your web page. The other thing that is a bit of an issue is redirect chains. Now, people are really obsessed with this in the SEO world, and a lot of the time I kind of say, actually, it's not commercially worth fixing a lot of them, but it massively slows down mobile web page speed. So if you've got a lot of people on a mobile device, every time they're browsing around the site, it will actually slow it down every time they're hitting a redirect, because what happens is they load up that, then they have to load up that, and then they have to load up that. So particularly on mobile phones, sort out your redirect chains. Okay, the next thing is the prefetch and render. So interestingly, at Just Eat, for instance, we knew that everybody who loaded up the web page would probably go to the search results, so we could preload that. So we basically said, right, load this up when it happens. And we could significantly improve the speed at which this page loaded up. Preload is just a little bit of head content or JavaScript, and it can be put in relatively simply and easily if you know where it's going. In fact, there's a script which will actually help you with this. This is called Instant Page, and you can put this onto any website using Google Tag Manager, and 99% of the time it will improve your web page phenomenally. Now, what was interesting is when we tried this on Just Eat, we had an issue where when they started going down the lists, they would kind of put their mouse over a lot of different ones, and that's how this script works, It would actually try and load up it as you hover over the thing. Now, we actually had to rewrite the script to work for Just Eat, because otherwise we found people were trying to load up quite a lot of different pages. So we were increasing server load as a result of that. So I've just seen the time. I'm kind of slower than normal. And we also recommend making sure that you use this pre-connect and prefetch, DNS prefetch across the site as much as possible to make sure things are going as fast as you possibly can. And as I say, defer all the scripts. Service workers is very exciting. Now, service workers is how we have significantly improved page speed. And what we do there is we basically say that it's a bit of JavaScript that is using for the progressive web apps. Progressive web apps are new, exciting, and very, very, very exciting. The reason I say this is that will actually make it so as a website can run offline. If a website runs offline, it'll kind of work incredibly effectively or even when you're connected. So it'll basically say, right, what I want to do is load up the CSS, the JavaScript, all of those bits and pieces. So as you're browsing around, it'll only load elements of the page that aren't included in the service worker. And what's kind of exciting there is that there's an air horn. You can actually install this on your own phone as a web page, and it will work when you're not connected to the internet. The other thing that I've kind of mentioned is this SPA stuff is single page apps. What I find really exciting here is the fact that you don't need to load every single web page up. You can reload pages into it, and that is very, very cool. So basically, once you've loaded one page, you can load the next page into it by using JavaScript. AMP. So Google have been talking a lot about AMP, and a lot of SEO folks really hate it. So we know that it's basically almost creating another set of code replicating your web page that only Google kind of uses in a certain way. Now, what is kind of interesting is if you code your entire website in AMP, it's brilliant. But creating a second copy of your web page to be faster for some users seems like a waste of time. My feeling is that if you've got the resource, get your developers to speed up your main website as fast as possible and efficiently. Like I say, Jono, who's an expert in page speed stuff, he basically says use AMP as your main content, your main website, rather than trying to create as an alternative set of pages. So I think that's really, really kind of important and interesting. So takeaways. I'm going over time here, so make sure you've got Google Search Console. Make sure you use Screaming Frog to find the biggest issues. Lightbulb test every single page. Sorry, Lighthouse test every single page that you think is kind of important. Image sizes and compression is very, very important. Font optimization. Concentrate on your users rather than the page speed metrics. Use a CDN for images and static files. If possible, use a CDN for all of the site, but dynamic sites do suffer a little bit worse. And if you struggle, give us a shout at Rise at 7, of course. The other thing is there are hundreds of amazing web articles about it all. This is one of my favorites. It's basically by Why Performance Matters, and it's on developers, Google developers. There's an amazing presentation by Emily Grossman, and there is also Bastian, who's been talking today as well. I was just watching his presentation. And as I say, it is that death from a thousand cuts. Make sure that you revisit all of this work that you've been doing and kind of get rid of as much as you possibly can. That's where things really are a problem. Cool. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. Has anybody got any questions? No questions? Okay. Cool. As I said, I'm running over time, so I'll wrap it up there. But basically, I did ask on Twitter, and lots of people had some great suggestions. I will share the slides afterwards. So as to basically, if anybody's got any questions, then feel free to message me. It's gerry@takeitoffline.co.uk. And that's it. Yeah. Cool. Talk to you guys soon.